Good afternoon. It is afternoon. I'm Harry Cooper, Senior Curator and Head of Modern and Contemporary Art here at the You can buy one of these too if you want to. And I am very happy to see all of you here for one thing and to introduce Adam Greenhalgh, who is Associate Curator at the National Gallery. And since 2015, he has been our man in Rothko land, leading a team that includes Layli Nasser and Michaela Milgram on an amazing project of creating a catalog raisonné of Rothko's works on paper. Adam joined us in 2012 when he was the Andrew Mellon postdoctoral curatorial fellow in the Department of Prints and Drawings. And there you may remember his shows such as the serial Impulse at Gemini in 2015. And he also curated Yes, No, Maybe prints at Crown Point Press in 2013, co-authored that catalog, mounted a display of John Cage's prints, John Cage Rock, Paper, Scissors to commemorate Cage's centenary in 2012. Before NGA, Adam worked at the Clark Art Institute as well as the Corcoran. He has degrees from the University of Maryland, PhD, Williams, MA, and UVA, BA. And but most important for this occasion is that he is the curator of the amazing show upstairs, Mark Rothko Paintings on Paper. And in my experience here, I have not seen a show as luminous in its presentation, as clear in its argument, and just as radiant in its experience. So I think, I hope you agree, this is NGA at its best. And Adam is going to explain it all to us. Adam.
Thank you, Harry. That was too kind. And now I'll try my best to live up to that high praise. Thank you all for coming. Without further ado, okay. Mark Rothko is best known for the abstract canvases he developed after 1949, a selection of which you see here. Soft-edged horizontal rectangles are arranged against monochrome backgrounds. Contrasting colors, gestural brushwork, and tension between forms produce vivid visual effects. The paintings can seem to pulse and shimmer, swell and recede. Rothko's facility with paint and the range of effects and moods he was able to coax from a seemingly simple compositional formula can be mesmerizing. His paintings can be somber, serene, radiant. He was, though, to be clear, no mere formalist. Rothko, seen here in his studio in 1964, aimed to express, in his words, basic human emotions, tragedy, ecstasy, doom, and so on. Indeed, viewers often report intense emotional responses to his paintings. Although best known for these towering paintings on canvas, Rothko also made nearly 3,000 works on paper. Over half are graphite or ink drawings, figure studies, portraits, still lifes, and prosaic domestic scenes, as well as preparatory studies for paintings. Drawing was a regular activity for Rothko, as was, it would seem, drawing other people drawing. But drawing for Rothko was also a private activity. His drawings were personal, not intended for exhibition or sale. And despite his early commitment to drawing, he pretty much abandoned it in the early 1940s. On the other hand, Rothko painted on paper using watercolor, oil, and acrylic applied with a brush from the very beginning of his career, around 1925, to his death in early 1970. He made about 1,000 paintings on paper. Of these, about 600, were intended to be public-facing, by which I mean they were sold, exhibited, or given as gifts during his lifetime, or vetted by him for potential sale. This focus on public versus private is relevant because Rothko was extremely careful, controlling even, about how his works were displayed and to whom they were sold. The relationship between a work of art and a receptive viewer was quite possibly his most abiding concern. He wrote about this in 1947, I quote, "A picture lives by companionship, expanding and quickening in the eyes of the sensitive observer. It dies by the same token. It is therefore a risky and unfeeling act to send it out into the world." Rothko had examined this theme in a small early watercolor that opens the exhibition upstairs. A figure sits before an easel painting of a blue-skinned, pink-haired alter ego. The earthen palette of the room contrasts with the vibrant, expressive portrait on the easel. The painted character beckons with a curved blue hook of an arm, as if inviting the viewer toward a mirror or portal. Bubblegum pink reflects onto the seated figure, tinting her face. The pair, twinned, mirrored, stare at each other intensely, locked in silent communion. In this knotty little watercolor, the act of looking is transformative and reciprocal. The painting on the easel comes to life through an active dialogue with its viewer. This, it would seem, is the kind of viewing experience Rothko hoped to cultivate with an attentive and committed viewer. So if it's a risk to send pictures out into the world, the obvious question, it seems to me, would be which works did Rothko think were worth that risk? In deciding to send works on paper out into the world, Rothko intentionally included them in the main narrative of his artistic project, how he chose to represent himself and his work to the public. These are the works on paper that Rothko himself believed merited attention, study, and interpretation, and they are the focus of the exhibition upstairs. While Rothko painted on canvas in every year of his career, his engagement with paper ebbed and flowed. 4 particularly fruitful periods when he produced significant numbers of works on paper that he exhibited, sold, or gave as gifts, reveal the impact of painting on paper on the trajectory of his work overall. Watercolors from the mid-1930s reveal his early artistic aspirations and influences. Symbolic works of the mid-40s show Rothko searching for what he considered to be timeless and tragic subjects relevant to the turmoil of contemporary global events. In the late 1950s and late 1960s, Rothko created hundreds of paintings on paper in his signature abstract style. These 4 periods highlight Rothko's engagement with painting on paper. Tracing them sheds new light on the development of his style, as well as the role paper played in his success and the establishment of his reputation as one of the preeminent artists of the 20th century. These 4 critical moments provide the structure of the exhibition upstairs, as well as my talk today. Part 1, Aspiration, the mid-1930s. In the summer of 1933, Rothko, who was still then known by his full name, Marcus Rothkowitz, hitchhiked nearly 3,000 miles from New York City to his hometown of Portland, Oregon. His Jewish family had immigrated from what is now Latvia to Portland 2 decades earlier. Rothko painted numerous landscape watercolors during his visit, including these views of the city from the hills in Forest Park. He was accompanied by his wife, Edith Sacker. They had married the previous November, and the ostensible purpose of the trip was to introduce Edith to Rothko's family. Of greater relevance to our story, though, is the fact that Rothko had his first solo exhibition that summer at what is now the Portland Art Museum. He included in the show watercolor landscapes like these, and like this pair, made from a similar vantage point above the Columbia River. The lively brushwork, particularly the staccato hatching and jostling parallel strokes, recall Paul Cézanne and John Marin, 2 artists Rothko admired. The trip marked both a personal and a professional milestone for the aspiring artist. At 29 years of age, he was married, and with a first solo museum show to his name, he could arguably declare himself to be a professional artist. Despite favorable reviews, Rothko struggled to sell his early work. In the absence of sales, he gave numerous Portland watercolors as gifts to his relatives and friends, including this pair. Handing out paintings was a sign of affection, but maybe also a gesture that reinforced his career choice to his skeptical family, who had expected him to become a lawyer or an engineer. A familiar story, I'm sure. It may also It may also have been an act of wishful thinking, sharing as aspirational advertising. These watercolors also functioned as a form of currency. The struggling artist offered them in exchange for services that he could not otherwise afford. This vignette of an Oregon forest, for example, was one of a group that Rothko gave to a doctor at Mount Sinai Hospital as payment for house calls in the late 1930s. To supplement his meager income, Rothko taught children's art classes at the Center Academy of the Brooklyn Jewish Center. He took teaching seriously. He curated exhibitions of his students' work and published on the benefits of art training and appreciation. In his teaching, he emphasized personal expression over technical facility, and he practiced what he preached, painting quickly and intuitively, clearly delighting in the fluidity of water-based paints. He even used colored construction paper, a cheap pulp paper produced and marketed primarily for children's use. The half-length portrait of an intensely focused woman in a striped orange blouse on the left features the saturated color, swirling and bleeding Rothko was able to conjure from these humble materials. Rothko observed that, and I quote, "The real essence of the great portraiture of all time is the artist's eternal interest in the human figure, character, and emotions, in short, in the human drama." He singled out Rembrandt, on whose portrait he appears to have modeled his own. But his early figurative watercolors reveal other sources too. Cézanne foremost when it comes to portraits, but for guidance in his figurative work, he was also looking at Matisse, but also Degas and perhaps Picasso. He would have seen examples of these artists in illustrated books or in New York museums. He was a regular visitor to the Met and MoMA. We can see in these early works an aspiring artist engaging with his role models while searching for his own voice. Despite the confrontational directness of some of Rothko's portraits, his sitters can read as distant, absent. One senses that despite studying seriously the art of the past, he struggled with the convincing portrayal of a genuine personality. He often reduces faces to masks. Conveying emotional interiority through physiognomy to convey the human drama he so admired in his idols apparently did not come easily, or didn't jibe well with his expressive technique. Rothko would have to find other means of effectively conveying something of the human condition. In the summer of 1934, Rothko and Edith vacationed in Gloucester, Massachusetts with their friends, Milton and Sally Avery, and Adolf and Esther Gottlieb. The result of this trip was a series of beach scenes that reflects Rothko's apparent admiration for the bathers of Paul Cézanne. But with their high horizons and statuesque anatomies, Rothko's watercolors also follow, unsurprisingly, the example set by Avery himself, an older artist who was a friend and mentor to the younger Rothko. Actually, Rothko himself appears in Avery's painting here. He's the one in white with the green visor. Avery's painting, in which everyone stares at an embracing couple, would seem to be about the visual pleasure of people watching on the beach. Rothko's own bathers, though, strike a rather more anxious chord as they gaze unnervingly off screen at some unseen subject. In this small work in particular, which we believe was exhibited in 1935 at the Brooklyn Museum, a pair of figures are dwarfed by a dune that looms against a murky sky. Silhouetted against the up-tilted seashore, they are close together yet weirdly distant, like magnets of opposite polarity. Do they lean in like friends or veer apart? Twinned and slightly off-kilter, Rothko's pale bathers read a little like ghostly apparitions. They suggest a drama, some sort of allegory of the human condition, alienated, alone in a sandy wasteland, that belies the painting's small size and seemingly cursory execution. Rothko's spectral bathers speak to the necessity of human connection in the modern world. A few years later, he picked up the theme in a series of canvases depicting attenuated figures in prison-like or labyrinthine architecture of the New York subway system. Rothko conveyed a sense of the emotional and psychological isolation of the modern urban experience. He made numerous sketches in the subway, some quite haunting, but did not produce any finished works on paper devoted to the subject. Part 2, Breakthrough, the mid-1940s. From 1944, Rothko turned once again to paper and began to produce numerous watercolors intended to be shown publicly. His style transitioned in the early 40s to an idiom adopted from European surrealism, drawing inspiration from Miro, Tanguy, and others who aim to visualize the unconscious mind. Rothko's works from this period resemble underwater worlds populated with biomorphic figures or microorganisms. We see him in a rare photograph here in the middle of painting this watercolor, which you can see upstairs. In 1945, the influential dealer and collector Peggy Guggenheim held a solo show for Rothko at her gallery, Art of this Century, that included 15 canvases and a group of watercolors. This was Rothko's first solo exhibition since 1933. 3 canvases sold, including the large Slow Swirl at the Edge of the Sea, which was acquired by Guggenheim herself and is now in MoMA's collection. Slow Swirl depicts 2 biomorphic figures engaged in a languid, twisting dance. It was painted during the courtship of Rothko and Mary Alice Beestle, who went by Mel, and the figures are commonly read as stand-ins for the couple who would marry in 1945. At least 2 watercolors sold from Guggenheim's 1945 show too. Guggenheim herself purchased the large watercolor Sacrifice shortly after Rothko completed it in early 1946. Sacrifice, on view upstairs, was shown in several European exhibitions of Guggenheim's collection during Rothko's lifetime, making it one of the first works by the artist to be displayed outside the United States. In February 1946, Rothko submitted Baptismal Scene to the Whitney Museum's annual exhibition, from which it was acquired by the museum, making it the first work by Rothko in any medium to enter a museum collection. 2 anthropomorphic figures flank a smaller one over which water appears to cascade from a schematic fountain. With its pale tones and shallow composition, Rothko appears to have taken guidance from Piero della Francesca, one of his favorite Renaissance artists. Rothko here employs visual vocabulary familiar from Slow Swirl, but watercolor was arguably better suited than oil to the fluidity he used to evoke a religious ritual of purification by immersion. Much of the energy of Rothko's surrealist watercolors derives from the incorporation of ink lines, as in the fuzzy, bleeding, black ink tentacles of the central orb in this large watercolor in pale blue grays and golden browns. The forms in these aquatic watercolors appear to cleave, to both stick and split as they twist and spin. In a way, they prefigure the energies of Rothko's classic format paintings, in which fields seem to throb with magnetic pulses of both attraction and repulsion. In April 1946, the dealer Betty Parsons organized an exhibition of Rothko's watercolors. The show, in part, traveled to the San Francisco Museum of Art and the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. We've reunited in our exhibition upstairs 7 of the watercolors shown by Parsons in 1946, including this pair, Prehistoric Memory and Incantation. The exhibitions received favorable reviews, and almost all of the watercolors were purchased directly out of the shows or from Parsons shortly thereafter. As Rothko wrote to friends, "It was my most successful show. I sold enough to be able to give up my teaching, and one person invested more than $1,000 in the stuff." This was a turning point, a breakthrough, as Rothko put it, so maybe there is hope. As war raged and news of the horrors of the Holocaust spread in the 1940s, Rothko and his compatriots sought a visual language that could effectively speak to the traumas of contemporary global events. Rothko found in Jungian psychology and Friedrich Nietzsche's writings the key tenets that would guide his work at this point. Jung's notion of the collective unconscious posits that all individuals possess an inherited psychic foundation expressed through shared archetypes or symbols in art, religion, mythology, fairy tales, etc., regardless of temporality or geography, culture, or nationality. Nietzsche's book, The Birth of Tragedy, argued that life was a continual struggle between wild chaos and the serene and formal restraint of the aesthetic. He thought Athenian tragedy in Aeschylus or Sophocles, for example, was the highest form of art because it managed to combine the exuberant, passionate excesses of life with order and form into a seamless whole that reflected the full spectrum of the human experience, from ecstasy and joy to gloom and melancholy. This resonated with Rothko, who echoed Nietzsche's ideas in considering his purpose to be, quote, the expression in concrete form of the verities of time and space, life and death, and the heights of exaltation, as well as the depths of despair. So that's what Rothko was trying to paint. Rothko mined classical myth, literature, religious ritual, ancient and non-Western culture for subject matter that could tap into what he called the spirit of myth. He was convinced that tragedy, the joys of life tempered by the certainty of eventual death, united all individuals, past and present, and that evocations of past instances of tragic subject matter would resonate with his modern audiences. As he put it, there is no such thing as a good painting about nothing. The subject is crucial, and only that subject matter is valid, which is tragic and timeless. Among his favorite compositional motifs was a horizontally striated composition that resembles diagrams of geological layers or ocean zones overlaid with hints of buried artifacts, fossilized animal remains, or avian, aquatic, or cellular life forms. Geological strata operate here as a metaphor, perhaps, for humankind's deep collective psychological, emotional, and spiritual currents. Rothko felt in particular that tragic subjects of intense communal grief were particularly relevant to his own time as the world grappled with the brutality, terror, uncertainty, and anxiety of the decade. In Entombment 1, for example, a trio of ectomorphs appear to hold a horizontal form marked with lozenges that resemble the curves of a recumbent human figure. Rothko's title, Entombment, composition, and restricted palette recall burial imagery on Black figure Greek pottery that he studied at the Met. Indeed, Entombment 1 resembles, it seems to me, the ancient Greek practice of prophesis, a funeral rite in which the deceased is laid out for communal viewing. I can't help but see a hint of the motif even in earlier, more exuberantly colorful surrealist watercolors, a hint of tragedy lurking even within this aquatic beauty. Do you see it? It's fine. Agree, disagree, it's all right. Rothko explored similarly tragic themes drawn from Christian iconography. Omen, for example, echoes 17th century paintings that showed Jesus Christ being taken down from the cross after his crucifixion. The suggestion in Omen of a figure at right with upstretched arms and dangling legs evokes a lifeless body set against a cruciform structure. Blood-red drips allude to Christ's wounds and intensify the otherwise subtle palette. The central structure in The Journey similarly evokes the crucifixion, calling to mind numerous precedents from Grunewald's disease-riddled contortions to Francis Bacon's 1933 translucent wraith. Credit to my colleague Layli Nasser for making that connection. The link with Bacon is speculative, admittedly, but maybe both artists were looking at Rembrandt's slaughtered ox with its splayed limbs and exposed ribcage. The iconography of crucifixion, if nothing else, was a subject Rothko had studied in numerous drawings earlier in the decade, particularly the motif of nail-punctured, dismembered limbs. Watercolor suited Rothko's desire to visually suggest a sense of hazy memory, the historical past, or the nebulous emotional or spiritual realms. Backgrounds are painted with dilute washes, indistinct and cursory shapes flicker. Forms are mirrored vertically, undulating like reflections across the ripples on a body of water. Indistinct and suggestive are the key terms here. Rothko also scraped, rubbed, and gouged passages in these watercolors with surprising energy to lend their surfaces the appearance and texture of great age and wear, as you can see in this detail of Entombment 1. In Tentacles of Memory, Rothko wiped away lines of watercolor paint and then inscribed those stripes of exposed paper with an ink pen. The resulting marks recall incised antique pottery decorations or prehistoric rock carvings. Painting in these works is akin to an excavation or exhumation, neatly aligning artistic practice, scraping, rubbing, gouging, with Rothko's desire to mine the past for timeless subjects relevant to the present. In 1947, Rothko submitted Vessels of Magic to the Brooklyn Museum's biennial watercolor exhibition, from which it was acquired by the museum, making it the 5th work by Rothko to enter a museum collection. 4 of the first 5 works by Rothko to enter public collections were paintings on paper, clockwise from left: Brooklyn, S.F. Boma, Whitney. All are in our exhibition upstairs. Rothko was delighted by Brooklyn's acquisition of Vessels of Magic. In a note to the curator, he wrote that Vessels was one of 5 large watercolors that marked a, quote, culmination of a period of concerted painting in this medium. Sacrifice and Omen were also among the 5 that Rothko considered to be his best works in watercolor. I suspect that this untitled work may also have been in that quintet. All 4 of these are on view upstairs. The current whereabouts of the 5th missing work is unknown. Rothko's style began to evolve in the later years of the decade. His surrealist and archaic motifs are reduced, clarified, simplified into a more schematic mode, as I hope you can see here. And vaguely figurative forms dissolve over about a year to hazy shapes and swirling backgrounds. Despite his success, Rothko appears to have concluded that relying on mythological, religious, or historical iconography was not as effective in expressing his aims as he had hoped. To really express something of the universal human experience, he needed to clarify his means and eschew recognizable subject matter altogether. In 1947, he declared that the familiar identity of things has to be pulverized. Echoes of figures, though, resist complete pulverization, it seems to me, or hints reemerge in order to be fully and finally annihilated. Here I spy the hint of a half-length figure, torso, shoulders, head, emerging from a colorful soup. Anyone else see it? No? Okay. No problem. Thank you. Thank you for your support. All right, I'll go one step further. Am I the only one who sees the echo or mirror image of the earlier watercolor of a woman in orange stripes? Yes, no, that's okay. All right, great. We're all on the same page. Maybe, I got a maybe. Yes, no, maybe. Okay, so out of these late 1940s abstractions, which have come to be known as multiforms, emerged the free-floating blobs, blocks, and horizontal bands that come to characterize Rothko's work from 1949 onward. He would translate the thin washes and dilute glazes of his watercolor technique to the canvases that would dominate his output for the final years of the decade. In a 1952 interview, Rothko made clear that the transition from his early figurative works to his mid-1940s archaic watercolors to the fully abstract forms of his mature phase was not just a matter of the background supplanting the figures. It was not, he said, that the figure has been removed, but that the shapes in the later paintings were new substitutes for the earlier figures. He also described his abstract forms as possessing the volition of organisms. And he also wrote, "I think of my pictures as dramas. The shapes in the pictures are the performers." Rothko's own understanding of the relevance of the 1940s works on paper to his later style is confirmed by the inclusion of 4 watercolors in his seminal 1961 exhibition at MoMA, which traveled to 6 venues in Europe over the following year. Here, installation shots from MoMA and Whitechapel Gallery in London, in which you can see the 4 mid-40s watercolors. And here, a photograph I like of an engaged visitor in the show at Whitechapel with the Whitney's watercolor baptismal scene in the foreground. Rothko was heavily involved in the selection of works for this show. These 4 watercolors were the only works on paper displayed, and they were the earliest of any type in the show. The 44 other paintings on view were canvases dating from 1947 to 1960. So in his earlier letter to the Brooklyn Museum, Rothko had described his large 1946 watercolors as a culmination, by definition, the highest or climactic point, a pinnacle. At MoMA in 1961, he positioned this quartet of watercolors as the beginning of his mature work, the precursor to the abstract canvases in what is now known as his classic format. We have reunited this foursome upstairs. All right. Part 3, Respite, the late 1950s. By 1949, Rothko had arrived at his favorite format, soft-edged rectangles arranged vertically against a monochrome background. Although he mostly developed this idea on canvas throughout the 50s, in the final 2 years of the decade, he made nearly 60 paintings on paper in a remarkable burst of activity. He had painted fewer than half a dozen paintings on paper in the preceding years of the decade, one of which you see here. In June 1958, Rothko accepted a commission to paint a series of canvases for the Four Seasons restaurant in the Seagram building. Over the next year, he painted about 30 large-scale canvases for the project in shades of dark, orange-tinged crimsons and blacks on deep maroon backgrounds. 7 would have been installed had he not abandoned the project in late 1959 on ideological grounds. He was concerned that the swanky restaurant was not an appropriate environment in which to appreciate his art. A decade later, he gave 9 of the Seagram canvases to the Tate in London, a view of which you see here. During the Seagram project, Rothko returned to paper to make a series of small, frieze-like studies. He also painted 5 larger works on paper that explore the architectonic structure of the canvases. Beyond the scope of the Seagram project, Rothko made about 15 paintings on paper in late 1958. These are not studies or sketches, not related to the Seagram project. They are independent and finished paintings in their own rights. And in 1959, he painted approximately 40 more. Backgrounds are painted with dilute washes, often in water-based media, which lends them a liquid intensity. Rothko's soft-edged rectangular forms in oil stand in stark contrast, asserting themselves by pushing against or receding from the surface of the picture plane. Rothko's palette on canvas darkened around 1957, shifting away from the sensual yellows, oranges, and reds of the earlier part of the decade towards maroons, browns, and deep crimsons. But his paintings on paper of 1958 and 59 span the entire color spectrum. Some arrange assertive hues in bold configurations. Others are smoky, diffuse, or stony. Applied quickly and in thin layers, Rothko's pigments appear to infuse the textured watercolor paper. Light penetrates the paint and reflects off the bright white support beneath, producing a strong internal glow. Darker paintings such as these recalled spilled wine or crushed fruit, their surfaces at once delicate, matte, and velvety. But as I mentioned at the beginning, Rothko was not solely focused on formal concerns. As he put it in 1956, I'm interested only in expressing basic human emotions, tragedy, ecstasy, doom, and so on. And the fact that lots of people break down and cry when confronted with my pictures shows that I communicate those basic human emotions. He concluded, with a touch of belligerence, I think, that if you are only moved by their color relationships, then you miss the point. Rothko's canvases on the 1950s are commonly built up with numerous layers of thin glazes. This produces variegated tonal shifts and dazzling optical effects. On paper, though, Rothko achieves, I would say, similarly compelling experiences through more subtle gestural brushwork and nuanced color transitions. This is a good example. The fields, in a narrow tonal range of red, salmon, orange, jostle for space. The central field overlaps the upper field, but not the lower. Its feathered top edge frothy and airy like cotton candy's spun sugar filaments. The central pink was painted over white, which peeks out at the lower edge and tinges the field with a pale luminosity. The whole is fleshy, juicy, organic, pulsing with life, seeming to breathe and expand gently, rhythmically. Or so, I think. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. A photograph of a social gathering taken in the family's East 95th Street brownstone around 1962 includes this painting, indicating the artist's affection for it. Another photograph, this one taken in 1967, also reveals something of how Rothko presented himself via his paintings on paper. He poses in the reception room of his studio at 157 East 69th Street, where a pair of mounted paintings on paper from 1959 hang. This semi-public space is where Rothko would have hosted visitors, made sales, signed contracts, etc. Of the 55 or so paintings on paper that Rothko made in the final years of the 1950s, many sold very quickly to collectors. Very few have made their way into public collections. As such, they have maintained a relatively low public profile. This belies Rothko's apparent affection for them and the proud and prominent way he displayed them. Incidentally, this is the painting on the left in the photo. It's in the show upstairs. Several of the paintings on paper of 1959 share a compositional structure, a large, soft-edged central field bracketed by 2 slimmer ones. This is a new variation on Rothko's template of the 1950s. The format resembles a window or mirror with lintel above and pedestal or sill below. The Seagram murals present a series of dark voids, empty frames, or blocked doorways in a horizontal format. This arrangement was inspired, according to one of Rothko's assistants, by turning a classic format painting on its side. I hope you can see that relationship here. The suggestion of dark portals or blank voids was also prompted by the blind interior windows and blank walls of Michelangelo's vestibule of the Laurentian Library in Florence. Rothko had visited in 1950 and again in 1959. He had dreamed of making an architectural space, a room that would be inescapably immersive for his viewers. So his admiration for Michelangelo's perverse, blocked-up windows and suffocating interior makes a certain amount of sense. Some of the horizontal Seagram murals are nearly 9 feet tall and 15 feet wide. Canvases from the 1950s can measure almost 10 feet tall. With his giant canvases, Rothko had hoped to envelop and overwhelm viewers, to control them, to dominate them with sublime awe and size. The much smaller paintings on paper cannot hope to physically dominate viewers or walls, so the engagement is more tightly calibrated, more direct. The intense colors and simply painted forms producing a compelling magnetic attraction without the enormity. Many of the 1959 paintings on paper measure 38 inches tall, about the head to hip measurement of a man of Rothko's height, which was about 5 feet 11 inches. The more human scale produces the effect of looking into a mirror. As the figure in Rothko's early watercolor looks at a portrait perfectly scaled to match her own body, looking at one of Rothko's smaller scale paintings on paper induces a sense of seeing oneself reflected in or obscured by his luminous forms. The mirroring effect is enhanced by Rothko's stipulations for presenting his classic format paintings on paper as substantial and embodied three-dimensional objects rather than flat sheets. Rothko intended these works to be mounted rather than framed on hard panel or linen on a strainer or stretcher about 1 to 1.5 inches deep. Rothko's unconventional preferences lend his paintings on paper the appearance and presence of his works on canvas. They also offer viewers an opportunity for direct, uninterrupted engagement, which was of utmost importance to the artist. As he said in 1959, a painting is not a picture of an experience, it is an experience. Part 4, revitalization, the late 1960s. From 1960 to 1967, Rothko made on average just 1 or 2 paintings on paper each year. In 1962, he had produced about 40 small studies on paper for a cycle of 5 canvases for the Holyoke Center on Harvard's campus. The canvases were installed in 1964. The studies triggered a handful of remarkable small drawings that convey the pulsating energies of Rothko's favored format in jittery ink contour lines and delicate gray washes. In 1967, he made about 24 small paintings on paper. These followed the completion of a large commission that had consumed him for the previous 3 years, a series of dark purple-black canvases for a chapel in Houston conceived by Dominique and John de Menil. As he had after the Seagram project, Rothko returned to paper, seemingly both relieved and energized to be working on a smaller scale and with more immediate reward. In April 1968, Rothko suffered a near-fatal and inoperable aortic dissection. His doctor advised a change in diet and lifestyle and forbade the artist from making paintings over 40 inches in height. After recuperating for several months, Rothko returned to work, starting small. Staggeringly, he completed nearly 120 paintings on paper by the end of the year. He also painted 3 canvases, making 1968 the most productive year of his career to date. When Rothko's friend Dora Ashton visited him in February 1969, he showed her recent paintings on paper from 1968, the exact number of which he apparently tallied with pride, as though to say, as Ashton put it, "With all my trouble, I was able to do this." Whether defiant or distraught, Rothko worked with unprecedented productivity for a man who was, by all accounts, depressed, scared, and physically limited. The artist Robert Motherwell described Rothko in July 1968 as frightened, immobile, and almost metaphysically lonely. On September 13, 1968, Rothko signed his last will and testament. It named the Mark Rothko Foundation as the primary beneficiary of his estate. At the same time, he undertook an inventory of the works of art in his possession, his works of art. Works stored in off-site facilities were brought to Rothko's Manhattan studio, which you see here. Dan Rice, Rothko's assistant, documented the inventory, recording information about more than 800 works on 70 pre-formatted pages, each imprinted with Rothko painting catalog. Each documented work was photographed by Rothko's friend Morton Levine, an anthropology professor and photography enthusiast. You're seeing here a scan from one of Levine's slides on the left. The painting catalog page where this painting on paper was documented is on the right. And here, two of Levine's slides of canvases. Not in good health, Rothko appears to have been getting his affairs in order. The inventory seems to have been intended to identify works for immediate sale by his dealer or posthumous sale by his foundation to fund its charitable work. Importantly, the painting catalog does not document every work in Rothko's possession at the time of the inventory. It included about 400 canvases and about 400 paintings on paper. In selecting works to include, Rothko did not divide his oeuvre by medium or support. Rather, with an eye on posterity, he appears to have distinguished by function or status private versus public. More than a practical and tedious accounting, the inventory entailed a reckoning. Rothko was deciding, I think, what he wanted to allow to go out into the world and what he wanted to keep private. In a sense, he was curating his legacy. The largest groups of works on paper included in the painting catalog are watercolors from 1933 and 34, surrealist and multiform watercolors from 1944 to 1949, oil paintings from 1958 and 59, and paintings in oil or acrylic from 1967 to early 1969. The four critical stages surveyed in our exhibition, in other words. These were the works on paper that he decided could be sent out into the world in the eventuality of his death. Rothko continued to produce paintings on paper at a rapid clip after the inventory. He also dramatically increased their size by working on sheets cut from large rolls. They range in height from between 4.5 feet to 7 feet tall. The largest are on par with the dimensions of many of his abstract canvases made after 1949. Paintings on paper from 1968 and 69 varied greatly in composition, palette, and effect, from fiery and explosive to placid and caliginous. Some are painted with minimal layering of paint, while others are built up from numerous applications. Some are dark and inky, while others combine unprecedentedly phosphorescent colors. Deep, rich fields painted with bravura brushstrokes against radiant backgrounds create striking paintings that blaze from within. They display vigor, vitality, erupting with volcanic energies and compositional tension. Rothko once said, "You think my paintings are calm, like windows in some cathedral? You should look again. I'm the most violent of all the American painters. Behind those colors, there hides the final cataclysm." In his late works on paper, amplification is the name of the game. In scale, in the energy and force of paint handling, and in the immediacy, intensity, and potency of the colors. Rothko worked in 1969 on multiple paintings simultaneously. Oliver Steindecker, his assistant, would cut numerous sheets from rolls of paper and affix them with tape or staples or both to large easels in his studio. Rothko used at least 2 easels for his paintings on paper. This one, which you can see upstairs, is about 15 feet tall. It was originally constructed in the 1960s for painting canvases. You can see it behind Rothko in this photograph from 1964. The other easel is a 10-foot wall of unpainted plywood used only for paper. As he painted on sheets taped to the easel, he brushed beyond their edges. This left painted rectangular silhouettes after finished sheets were removed. Carefully removing tape from a completed painting, Rothko realized, left a border of unpainted paper. At some point around the middle of 1969, he decided to systematically retain it as part of his compositions. Prior to this, edges would have been trimmed when works were mounted. Upstairs, you can see a pair, there's a white border, hope you can see it. Upstairs, you can see a pair of paintings that retain their gloriously messy edges. Examining the perimeters of these sheets reveals the multiple layers of underpaint. The seemingly small move of incorporating a pale border into the composition alters the internal spatial logic of the works. producing a more complicated relationship between viewer and painting. The white border of unpainted paper sets the painted forms back in space as though you're looking through a frame or window. At the same time, though, it reinforces the flatness of the painted surface. When mounted, as Rothko intended, these paintings have a physical presence. The tension between the flat surface of the sheet, the depth of the mount, the deep space of some of the streaky, inky backgrounds, and the variably reflective or light-absorbing fields of some of the dark paintings like these can produce a disorienting and puzzling phenomenological experience. In late 1969, Rothko produced a series of some 30 large paintings on paper known as the Brown and Greys. We have 5 of them upstairs. They have just 2 fields in a palette that ranges from chocolate to taupe to gunmetal. The fields extend to a sharply defined unpainted border, their horizontal juncture often emphasized by overlapping paint from the lower field, exposed paper, or bright highlights. Rothko probed this format over the course of the series, adjusting the height of the juncture between fields and varying their relative tone, saturation, and facture. Painting several at once on his large easels, Rothko was clearly thinking and working serially, just as he had in the past for mural commissions. And indeed, this series may have been initially conceived in response to a commission from the UNESCO headquarters in Paris for a room containing a sculpture by Alberto Giacometti. The project, though, was never realized, and it's not clear how seriously or for how long Rothko entertained the proposition. The Brown and Greys are generally considered dark paintings, but the range of tonality is so varied that the term is, in fact, a misnomer. The lower field of a particularly pale one roils and churns, and Rothko's shades of taupe swirl with greys ranging from dove to granite, from fog to mushroom. The passage calls to mind the mottled splotches and veinings of travertine or marble, or the dense spray and spume of Turner's late works, of which Rothko was an admirer. The Brown and Grey paintings, with their emphatic horizon lines, were also early on compared to lunar photographs taken during the Apollo 11 mission in July 1969, just a few months before Rothko made these paintings. He strenuously denied landscape associations, but he might have appreciated the reflection on humankind's place in the universe inspired by these views from the moon. Underscoring the primacy and generative force of paper at this moment in his practice, Rothko incorporated a painted white border in a series of 18 closely related canvases known collectively as the Black and Greys. The paint no longer turns the corner around the edge of the stretcher as it had done in earlier canvases. You can see the white edge on the canvases and papers in this photograph taken in Rothko's studio, where in December 1969, the artist invited a group of friends and critics to see his latest paintings, which he considered to be amongst his best. His guests were nonplussed and dismissive, seeing the paintings as reflective of the artist's deteriorating physical and mental health and a premonition of his death. Indeed, after Rothko died by suicide just 2 months later, on February 25th, 1970, the dark palette of these works and others of the second half of the decade became quickly associated with his death, a link that persisted. These haunting photographs of Rothko's empty studio were taken by Morton Levine shortly after the artist's suicide. They show black and gray canvases and brown and gray paintings on paper arranged side by side. The equivalent status and close relationship between the two series, paper and canvas, is clear, as is the significance they must have held for Rothko for him to have them arranged around his studio like silent witnesses, sentinels, or guardians in his final days. I find these photographs to be eerie, unsettling, like crime scene photographs, but of what kind of crime, I'm not exactly sure. In the same weeks that Rothko painted the Brown and Greys, he also produced a remarkable suite of opalescent and pastel-hued paintings on paper with soft, brushy, cloud-like edges. Reducing his palette, Rothko painted quickly and expressively with just 1 or 2 paint layers in shades of silvery gray, lavender, lilac, salmon, mauve, terracotta, and dusty rose, and allowed the paper to show through, between, and around forms, lending them a diaphanous lightness. Paintings on paper in blue, pink, and salmon were, we believe, painted after the Brown and Greys and the Black and Greys. That the brown and grays and black and grays were executed within weeks, if not days, of these more colorful paintings undermines a simple association between dark palette and dark mood or ill health. These late colorful paintings represent perhaps a fork in the road, a tributary or a startling variant that testifies to Rothko's creative energy and drive in what would turn out to be his final months. Rather than reading the brown and gray paintings as a grim endgame, perhaps they instead look backward. Can it be an accident that after reviewing dozens of earlier watercolors during the inventory, Rothko revived a palette of sepia, beige, and gray that recalls the coloring of the archaic watercolors of the 1940s? Not to mention a composition of sharp-edged horizontal striations. And what of the palette of the even earlier beach bathers in their sandy wastelands? Brown and grays not only call back to those figures on the beach, but also reinscribe them with some of the tragic and existential weight of the later paintings. The pale 1969 works similarly harken back to the shimmering marine biomorphic works of 1944 and 1945, the taupe-tinged gray clouds of late 1969 too, the subtle archaic watercolors of 1946. So too, the pinks and salmons. Some of these earlier works were no longer in Rothko's possession, of course, but works in a similar palette certainly were. Surely prompted by the inventory, Rothko told his friend, the artist William Scharf, that he wished he were producing in 1969 the kind of work he had done in the 1940s. We can't know exactly what he meant by that, what he was referring to, but the inventory appears to have triggered a retrospective, even nostalgic frame of mind, even as, arguably, it pushed his work forward in new directions. During the last 2.5 years of his life, Rothko made some 420 paintings on paper, many monumental in scale, compared to just 30 on canvas. We can only speculate where this creative urge might have led, since Rothko, famously taciturn when it came to explaining the meaning of his abstract paintings, was silent on the topic. Silence is so accurate, he once quipped. Yeah. What he also said was that art is an adventure into an unknown world, which can be explored only by those willing to take the risks. I should also point out that he famously hated critics and art historians, said they knew nothing and were, in his words, parasites on the body of art. So, in conclusion, maybe, as Rothko himself might have recommended, you should disregard everything I have said here today. And instead, with a clear mind and fresh eyes, go upstairs to the exhibition where you can take the risk of exploring in person his amazing paintings on paper.